That is really a question that's like like right out of a liberal playbook. It is interesting. Separate. The whole premise of that is a little strange. You see, to separate, one would once have had to been together, right? Well, they'll say like this: well, you're born in a state of spiritual death, which means you don't have a human spirit. They'll say. Well, I wouldn't call that separated. I would call that a non-existent human spirit. Their idea of connection to God is like, I don't know what. They'll say spiritual connection, but you see how they sort of transform it into the human spirit is touching the divine spirit. Like there's this touching going on. And it's really weird. I mean, you want to talk about mystical, the touching of spirits. What is that? I don't even know what that is. I mean, really, it's really strange. They'll say, but God is omnipresent. Really? He ain't touching your spirit, according to your doctrine. You got any explanations for that? What does omnipresent mean? Then they have to make up another doctrine. Well, he's just merely omnipresent. But you see, the touching, it's a specialized, localized, intensified residency. You didn't just make that up, did you? By perverting the word pleroma? Fullness. That means you're filled. I would say this. Look at it like this. I don't see why there's a problem. There shouldn't be a problem in just looking at it like two fellas. Two guys. Two guys are not seeing eye to eye. I don't know what kind of mystical views they have. Do they think God's walking around us here? Walking around all humans? Yeah, he's walking around, but he's not touching you. When Paul said, apart from the Lord, it's better to depart and be with the Lord. What is he talking about? So what does he mean? He's talking, face to face, right? In the presence and immediate locality of God. When he was talking about physical death. So what's the idea of sin separating? It certainly isn't. If you had no sin, you'd be born in heaven. I don't think so. So what do they mean by it? Separating. It's not physical location, you see. What is it? Well, there's this barrier. The idea is that God cannot be defiled by sin. He can't touch it. He can't touch sin. Well, since when is your human spirit sin? And what does that mean? Cannot touch sin. What does that mean? He cannot touch bank robbery? What does that mean? You see, it's like, he can't touch what? Sinful flesh? Look at it. An infant's born, and he doesn't even know his name. He isn't even thinking evil thoughts. He isn't thinking any thoughts. He's born with basically uninformed awareness, with his brain and neurons developing and connecting to where he can even control his eyeballs, lift his head. He can't even lift his head yet. He's completely incapacitated and unable to function, really. And he has involuntary movements, which he cannot control, and that's built in there genetically so that the baby would not atrophy. You see, if a baby, you see what I mean, he's not able to move, and if he doesn't have involuntary movements, you see, then his muscles atrophy, and it's not good for him. It's good for his circulation and all kinds of stuff, muscle development, and also, as I suppose, for the neurological development. So, what does it mean? You got an infant with what? A sinful body? And God, what? I can't have anything to do with him because I can't touch sin. The infant hasn't sinned. You see, if you want to suggest he did sin, I would say, or if someone did, I would say, why don't you just name what sin he's committing then, laying there? He isn't committing anything. He doesn't even have a testimony. You see, so he can't even lie. So basically, he's laying there, incapacitated. And so this idea that God cannot touch sin, he'll be defiled, what does that mean? It makes sin like a magical thing. Now I can understand if you were to say like this, God doesn't want to have anything to do with sinful men or something, just like the church, right? If you have somebody that needs to be excommunicated for whatever reason, he married his mother or something, as in the case of what? Corinthians? Excommunicated from the church. But that's not touching sin. I have no idea what touching sin is, and they don't either. They cannot explain it. What is God cannot touch sin? What does that mean? It means nothing. People were born, They're not even aware of the existence of God. Okay? So they're not even relating to Him. Now, you see, they're down here. You see, God's up there. You see what I mean? And now the Holy Spirit's around, but the idea is, you see, and as they grow up and they acquire false information and things like that, they're hostile in mind, but they're unaware of it. They don't see eye to eye with God and all that stuff, but they're unaware of it. So what's God supposed to do? I can't have nothing to do with them unless they're absolutely perfect. That's where they come up with the false doctrine. You see, positional truth. God punished Christ, pretended it was you, fooled justice. Justice thinks you're dead, but guess what? You're a new person all of a sudden. Boom. And justice can't find. Justice thinks the grave is, your body's still in the grave. And so then God does a rationalization through his mind. Look, you see, justice has been satisfied with them. And because sin has been punished, I can now touch sin. Because you see, you have to explain post-salvation sins. Now all of a sudden God can touch sin. It's weird. I have no explanation for that, and neither do they. God cannot touch sin lest he be defiled or something. But you see, even that's a lie, because it's like this. God can touch sin on the promissory note that it will be punished one day. Hence, how did God speak to Moses face to face as one does unto a friend before justice has been satisfied? So this touching sin thing, it's a figment of their imagination. It's a doctrine that's part of the false doctrines. And that's why it makes no sense. Sin separates us. In what way? You see. And how does an infant commit sin in order to be separate? Because they suggest that people were born without a human spirit at all. You see, and that's not separated. So, they don't have an explanation. And they can't explain how the infant sins or the newborn. How does he do it? They'll say, well, he's born sinful. What? Like he's got a sinful body? That ain't his fault. And so, you see, if you have a body that has a corrupt nature, it doesn't mean it's sinning right there, is it? He's laying there. He isn't even able to control his body. He isn't even able to control his eyes. All this kind of stuff. He's not functional yet. And you could say that within the genetic design you do have a corrupt nature. Well, fine. But you see, that's nothing to hold against the infant. The person inside the body, say, I can't have anything to do with that person inside the body. Why is that? Because the body's sinful. You see, that makes no sense whatsoever. One might ask if Jesus ever touched anybody while he was walking on the earth. I'm just saying. I've heard he has. What does it mean then? So you see the idea that the sin separates. But wait a minute. You got the promissory note that if sin is punished, God can touch sin before the punishment is even dealt out. Now you have a promissory note. And so God can touch sin. The barrier, you see, the supposed barrier between what? Abraham, Seth, seventh from Adam, Noah. Was the barrier removed? What are they going to say? They have no explanation for the pre-cross saints. Then God can touch sin on the promissory note that it will be punished one day. Now you see, what does God, man is separate from God, and God, there's a sin barrier. It doesn't mean anything then. Guess what? I heard there was a promissory note before this whole creation was created in a divine decree of God. Isn't the promissory note with regard to Abraham the promissory note to God? It isn't God making a promissory note to man. God's the one who has to have justice satisfied according to them, and sin has to be punished. God's the one who demands it. And so then, I thought he had that promissory note before the lamb that was slain before the foundations of the world. Then it winds up meaning nothing then. Then sin really doesn't separate us from God, because then you have the promissory note of punishment coming one day. And then after the cross, I'd say, what? It's already been dealt out, so why is man born separate from God? Because it's been punished. And then they say, well, that really isn't the problem, faith is. So they keep going round and round. Rather than the question of, does sin separate man from God, I would say this. It's good to look at how man is separate from God. He is separate from the life of God. He's separate from the righteous life. He's separate from God in that man is not in a lawful state. you see. And there are reasons for why he is not a man is born, and as he develops and grows up, well, first of all, he doesn't have the lawful view. Well, he has the corrupt nature, and it's overbearing. And now a man, you see, as he begins to grow up, he can, even as a child, he can learn the law. And then he can say, you see, with my mind, you see, I praise the law. But he says, for that which I want to do, be lawful, I cannot be. And so you see, a man can get the right information as in terms of, people really do understand the standard of what it is to be a decent person. I mean, they understand, thou shalt not lust over thy neighbor's wife or possessions or covet. They understand that. They understand, thou shalt not bear false witness. They understand what the standard is. Just scales, you shall not cheat your neighbor. They understand the standard. And so, man can desire the standard of goodness, you see, and he can learn it, but not achieve it. And so, if he's not able to achieve it, you see, this is man by himself, then he is not good. He does not live up to the standard. And he falls short for whatever reason. Inability, enslavement to the flesh or the corrupt natures and instincts, doing that which he does not want to do. And so, how man is separate from God is he doesn't live like God does. He doesn't see things the way God does. Though even though man can learn the most basic standards of goodness and all that stuff, he does not acquire the knowledge of God just sitting around thinking by himself without God involved. So God has to reach out to the man. Man can understand what the standard is. He can understand what it is to be lawful. He can understand that thou shalt not lust, for an example. And you see, he is separate from God in that he doesn't live like God does. He's not able to live up to the character that God has. And so the life in Christ, you see, is the separation from the corrupt nature that has to be put off because that hinders man. It keeps him in an unlawful state. Now, for those who want to, meanwhile, you see, he's in an unlawful state because the flesh is the problem, the corrupt nature, and so the man really isn't the problem. The flesh keeps him from being what he wants to be. Man is separate from God because you see how it is. He does not live like him. He does not react like him. He doesn't have the instincts like God does. The instincts, impulses, and desires of the flesh oppose the spirit at every turn. Man, enslaved to the flesh, all he has is the flesh to work with. And you cannot use the flesh to deliver yourself from the flesh. And so man is separate from God, the life of God, and that he doesn't live like God. He does not have all of the views that God has. He cannot live up to all of the standards. And so this is where you have God is needed to enable the man, and God aids him. And it is God who brings about the deliverance so that man can live like God does, or live like Jesus Christ did in the flesh. So, to live the life of Christ is you have to live like Christ did. He was God in the flesh, so you see how it is. He manifested and displayed the standard that it can be met, and so a man can meet the standard through him. And the ultimate deliverance, of course, is for these bodies to be changed so that man would no longer have these contrary instincts and impulses which hinder him. But for now, the idea is to mortify him and render them as though they are dead or inoperative. And so, you see, this is how man who is not living like God can live like God, is through God's help.